Welcome to South Harmon. Welcome to South Harmon. Hey, welcome to South Harmon. We glad you here today. Another AMA. Ask me anything. Super chat is cool if you wanna pay to play. Like and subscribe, that's what we really appreciate. Let me introduce you to the tear down king. Mike McNutted, ask your questions, he'll answer anything. ATM, you know I don't put them graphics on the screen. Glad you tapped in now, stay tapped in for the team. Hey, everything is posted. Go follow the socials. South Harmon FF tag us if we get noticed. Welcome to South Harmon, we glad you here today. Welcome to South Harmon, we glad you here today. Another AMA. Welcome to South Harmon, we glad you here today.
Yes, sir. Friday preview, man. We hijacked it. We hijacked Week 10. Week 10 is still one you want to win. But Koopa, brought some stuff to my attention, and I've been thinking about it too. So I'm like, you know what, man? No better day than Friday to go ahead and give you a little preview to the playoffs are around the corner, believe it or not. You need to start prepping now. Get ahead of everyone else prepping. Koopa, let's go ahead and talk about it. We're going to go through a couple things, but obviously looking currently at what's the season really looking like now. We got 9 weeks in, what the WoRP data is showing us, and then how do we kind of use this information to prep for our playoffs?
Yeah, we've got some we have enough significant data to be able to go, hey, we know what's happening this season. By the time we're at week 9, I mean, even week 4, we were like, we're starting to see the trend. But after 9 weeks of football, you have enough of a trend to be able to know how the next 8 weeks that we care about are going to play out.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
That's what we need. That's what we're here to talk about, is how are these next 8 weeks going to play out? And most importantly, how are the 3 most important weeks of 15, 16, and 17 going to play out? And how are you going to be able to win your championships?
And that's the big thing, right? If you take a look at the thumbnail, the main thing was, you saw maybe some things there, but the camera is the idea of capturing the WoRP, right? We're studying all this WoRP, but you're capturing the WoRP, and if you look in what you're capturing is also a title. So if you can, it's 3-week sprint really in the playoffs, right? You got to do everything you need to get there, but at the end of the day, all that matters is who wins those matchups, and finding, I think, the players that can be the right WoRP difference makers in the playoffs is the biggest thing, really, in fantasy. Obviously, you got to make it there, but once you're there, having the right guys and having the right roster construction can be really big to get a title. So let me just ask you this. First thoughts before we go screen share, just in general this year, how things are shaking out. Anything that's kind of standing out to you this year?
The biggest difference is wide receivers are dominating. If something that we'll do when we pull up the screen share is we'll compare weeks 1 through 9 of 2023 and weeks 1 through 9 of 2022. And when we were going over in the off season, hey, what does WoRP data look like of 2019, 2020, 21, 22? We saw the wide receiver line, it just kept creeping up and up and up and up. And if you compare 23 to 2022, it's a stark difference of how much higher that wide receiver line is.
Big time.
And so when we start talking about how we're going to want to build our teams to be able to take advantage of playoffs, it's going to be even stronger in that wide receiver realm that, hey, we want to make sure that we have these guys on our team.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some minute differences here and there, but I think that one to me is definitely outside of certain leagues which are very scoring, juiced or favored to other positions. If you're talking any type of PPR league, I don't even really care what the tight end premium is, frankly. Like a standard PPR league where the running backs aren't significantly up in WoRP, the wide receiver scoring is humongous. Like, it's honestly to the point to me, Coop, I'm curious your thoughts. Like, we talk about how important Superflex is, and I think even still certain formats, start 9, whatever, but right now, like wide receivers as far as who's winning, maybe not quite as valuable as Superflex, but this year more than ever, it's possibly the singular reason you could win even a Superflex league. So that part is crazy to me.
Yeah, the only quarterbacks that are really keeping up with the super top tier wide receivers are Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts.
Right.
Good luck going to try to buy those guys right now.
Right. Well, to your point and what I'm kind of getting at here, if you had, let's say, Hurts and Allen, that is still going to be almost hard to overcome for anybody in a Superflex league, right? But you could have, the Jared Goffs of the world at quarterback, but if you have the hammer wide receivers, that combination right now is showing far more deadly typically because of how deadly those receivers have been. Obviously, Tyreek Hill right now, and we'll get over to the screen share in a second, but Tyreek Hill right now is I'd be very curious to see if he plays like this in the playoffs, because for him to play that well is going to earn people buys, and then you get that one extra week off with him, and then if he plays well he could be one of the most owned title guys we've ever seen right now. It's insane.
I'm just going to give you a little bit of a preview and a warning on those words.
Okay.
Watch out for the playoffs.
The matchups.
Do we want to buy or sell?
So the
Tyreek
matchups
Hill's
are bad
not
for
looking
Hill?
good.
All right. Okay.
It's
what do we
not
got?
looking good, but we'll cover that when we get there.
Let's go ahead and go over to the screen share, man. Let's give the people what they want to see. All right. So I'm looking currently at this data, right? So this is the true. Koopa, I'll let you kind of drive. I'll talk.
Yeah.
I'll let you tell me what you want to see.
So we're looking at weeks 1 through 9, standard league. All right, everything is fine and dandy, and the best way to understand how we're going to try and predict is going to be look at what we know. And what do we know? We remember who won us championships last year.
Yep.
We remember who won us championships the year before. And what those sorts of teams looked like, whether they were quarterback heavy, running back heavy, wide receiver heavy. And so what I want us to do here is let's change our input. Remember what this looks like here on the right. Remember this graph.
So this is the true WoRP graph, everybody. By the way, Hater Maker, this is the creator of the first, original, and best WoRP tool in the game right here. So that's Koopa Troopa. He didn't technically make WoRP, all right? Just for clarification. He didn't invent WoRP, but he made the dopest tool that gives us the best chance to win because of it. So which one do you want to go to now?
So let's go to let's change our inputs on the left. Let's go to 2022.
Okay.
And let's change it to weeks 1 through 9.
Okay. Let's do 1
right,
through 9.
Because that's going to exactly match what we're looking at right now for 2023.
Look at you.
And so now we're going to look at this. And what's the first thing you notice? Our wide receiver line overlaps our running back line.
Well, see, one of the things for me, I don't know. I'm just trained, especially if I'm thinking about lineup, which we're looking at right now, right? In a lineup league, I'm looking at this left upper quadrant. That's what I'm paying attention to. And when I pay attention to the wide receiver line there, to the point you made, one, it's not what's carrying the entirety of it, right? And then two, the other thing is that, the running backs are not very far behind them, and the quarterbacks are still very, very elite here.
Yeah. So I'm looking at this going, all right, our quarterbacks are in this league specifically, we've got a couple of the quarterbacks that are still good, and you've got your wide receivers and running backs that are a little better in WoRP than those mid-tier quarterbacks.
Right.
And so if I was looking at just 2022, I would say, all right, I want to try and lean into some of the more skill position players. Try to lean into those wide receivers and running backs. Maybe try to lean out of the quarterbacks a little bit if I am in a position to make a run for the title. And unless I have one of those top guys.
Yeah.
But if we remember back to our 2023 was telling us that those wide receivers are doing way more than those running backs.
Yep.
And so if that's what we're looking at, I kind of want to see. I want to see if I can take my quarterbacks that, as long as they aren't Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts, because those guys are still way up there in the top left quadrant, that I want to see, can I maybe take one of those guys, flip them for somebody similar, and then snag a wide receiver on top? And especially looking at this is a lineup league. In the best ball leagues, it's a similar way where, hey, the wide receivers are better than the running backs, provided you don't have different scoring.
Choose scoring, yep. In standard PPR leagues, yep.
His standard PPR leagues. You want to be leaning into those wide receivers, and you want to be doing it a little bit early, too. Because the last thing you want to do is to let somebody else beat you to the punch, and somebody else has snagged that top-tier wide receiver. I was going to say Tyreek Hill, but let's hold off on the Tyreek Hill here for the second segment.
I get you.
From those managers that maybe are just going to miss the playoffs. Or I saw a question in there, what do you do when your team is perfectly mid? If you've got one of those guys in your league and you can snag some good wide receivers off that team, maybe you go and try to steal them from that manager before anybody else is really looking into, hey, this is what I need to bolster my team into the playoffs.
I like that. I think. Well, I'm curious then. So, I definitely like the idea of. Well, in general, but anytime I can down tier quarterbacks to where I'm not leaving the I'm not getting to scary hours in quarterback. I've always been kind of a fan of that, especially because I play a lot of best ball. But even in lineup this year, but to your point with how the wide receivers are playing, if you can get one somehow that matters, I think that's a huge potential way to get a player that is a difference maker or someone that could help your team at the right time. So with this line, looking at this and kind of we see where we're at now. With the preview of the playoffs in mind, are there specific obviously it's wide receiver, right? So specific positions, and then are there specific targets or specific wide receivers in general that you're looking to purchase that might be either discounted or you're saying, I don't even care, I'll pay full boat because I think this is something that can help me win a title?
So looking at the matchups for weeks 15, 16, and 17, I'm going to start with the reason I was talking about Tyreek Hill earlier.
Okay, let's hear it, man.
Tyreek Hill in week 15 plays the New York Jets.
Yeah, I saw that
in week 16 plays the Dallas Cowboys. That's an okay matchup.
Yep.
Week 17 plays the Baltimore Ravens. That is another horrible matchup.
That one is not good. That's a good team versus wide receivers. That's true so far. Yep.
The Dolphins have the worst strength of schedule for fantasy matchup for quarterback and wide receiver. They have the second worst for fourth worst for running back and second worst for tight end. If you're looking for, hey, who do I want to get in order to bolster my team for playoffs? Avoid Miami.
Interesting. Okay.
Because especially if you don't have a first round bye, that week 15 against the Jets is going to be a tough matchup to break through on.
Well, and I think so. I think here, right? What I would say is I wouldn't overthink a stud like Tyreek Hill if you have him at all, right? That's not what. But to the point you just made, though, I think if you're, I still think honestly, truly, Tyreek's been so good and still projects to be so good next year. If you're able to purchase Tyreek, I'm not going to tell you not to do that. But I think for most players in general on the offense, for example, the tight end one has totally not been one that's even all that relevant in Miami. It's not one I'm going to even mess around with. Jalen Waddle, maybe if you're thinking about purchasing him full. I don't know if you necessarily should do that if there's other options given the playoff run. And especially to the point you made about the running backs, I think Achane is so dynamic that he could pop one anytime, but we've seen Mostert be bottled up quite a bit lately. So depending on what the price is on him, I wouldn't necessarily overpay just to land him and think you're going to have a home run hitter running back every week.
Even with Achane, I would be wary about expecting that he's going to rip a big run for you on weeks 15 and 17. He might do okay for you. He also might totally flop.
Yeah.
But I would not bank on him having that game-winning week that you might be looking for out of him.
No, yeah, I think that's fair.
Probably want to look elsewhere.
I think with Achan, anyway, anytime you put him in your lineup, I think the reality is he is kind of boom or bust because he's not going to have a ton of touches locked in because of his size, and he's always going to be basically a guy that can give you a okay floor, but really it's not that. It's all about the ceiling. So he still could pop a long one in any game, but to the point you're making, heavily reliant on him, especially if you're, the rest of your team, like a lot of the people that are playing in week 15, they may not have the best roster construction anyway, right? So if you're relying on a guy like him to now push you over the top, that could be something that you're absolutely not going to get what you're hoping for out of, because he does. The whole Dolphins team, to Koopa's point, has a tough matchup in the playoffs. Okay, so then we have that. What are some matchups that you're looking at that are good? Or let me just ask you, who is there any players, before we get to the good matchups or playoff schedule, any players that are surprising to you in the WoRP line right now, or guys that you think relative to their market and what we've seen for 9 weeks are, worthy of checking out the price?
If you want to combine how they've been doing in WoRP plus what their matchup is for the playoffs,
that's what we're looking
There's
for.
a reason I put the Geno jersey on.
Uh-oh.
The Seahawks have an awesome playoff series. They go against the Eagles in Week 15, which have shown they're vulnerable to the pass.
Yep.
They go against the Titans, who have also shown that they're vulnerable to the pass. And they're going against the Steelers, who have been vulnerable to the pass for like 2 or 3 years now. And they have the number 1 best matchup for wide receivers. So you're looking at your DK Metcalf, your Tyler Lockett. They've been struggling a little bit this year. Their value's gone down. But if you want to make a savvy move, you buy low now, and you ride their points production the rest of the year.
Interesting one. Okay. So Seattle is – so what you're saying is Seattle has those players and the skill players on the receiving end especially have a path to fantasy success, possibly matchup-wise in the playoffs. Correct.
They have the easiest schedule in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver room.
Damn, okay. All right, well, what's nice about that, to your point, is that I actually almost now, for example, if this was flip-flop, let's create, just to give you an idea of why I like that, or the reason it could be good as far as buying. If it's Miami, if Miami had the best schedule in the playoffs, you can't buy those players. There's no chance, because they're already probably on winning teams, and everyone wants them, and they're going to go through the roof. You got to pay to go get those guys. But the Seattle playmakers, like Kenneth Walker started strong. He's actually been slow. The injury is kind of concerning to me time-wise, but the majority of the players right now have not been instrumental pieces for winning teams. DK Metcalf's been terribly disappointing, frankly, for fantasy. You got Lockett's been pretty boomer bust with plenty of busts. JSN's come a little long late, but not giving you much overall. So the reason I think that's good is because they are in the attainable bucket, and there's probably a bunch of teams willing to get off of all those guys.
Definitely, and I am sure that and this is, of course, if you're willing to risk it a little bit. We often see the rookie wide receivers, if they're going to come on, they come on the second half of their first season. If there would be a time for JSN to come on, and you want to take the gamble on him, it would be this season. Because
it's a good thing
he has
Mike's
the
not
matchup
here.
for it.
I was actually going to get to JSN. I was going to ask you about that, so you already beat me to it. So do you think, because I think that's one where I would say this typically, okay, as a wholesale as a way I kind of look at it in general, when I'm buying assets or players for my playoff push, typically I am not going to even consider underperforming rookies. I would normally, though, in a scenario like this, and I'm not saying I won't. The only thing with JSN is people really haven't sold low, right? People typically are not moving him at some super cheap price, but he is probably in a somewhat attainable bucket. Like he's nowhere near what we thought his value retention was going to be coming into the year. So do you think he's worth the gamble, I guess, is the question. Given that Lockett's still there, given that DK's there, do you think the schedule is worth the gamble for a playoff team, or do you think they're better off putting it in, using the capital or whatever players they want to sell for somewhere else? What's your genuine thoughts? Not a right or wrong answer.
My thoughts are, hey, let's put them somewhere else. But if I'm a contender that happens to have JSN on my team,
Okay.
I'm not going to try and sell JSN for someone else.
That's fair. Okay, I get that. I mean, I would say I like that. I'm typically not looking for, when I'm trying to go capture a title, right? I'm trying to go win a title. Typically, I'm not really looking to invest in rookies because I think sometimes people will try to thread the needle like that, and I think they end up kind of hurting themselves. Like you're wanting to thread this needle and play both sides of the coin. Like I want to be young and I want to win, and I think there's far safer options, I'll say, than JSN. But to your point, if you have him, I would not be just trying to panic sell because he hasn't been playing that well, if that makes sense. Like it obviously depends on the market too, like what I can actually attain for him. But I like that call. Okay, let me just ask you this then. The tight end line, the running back line, is there what's your thoughts on, one, the positions so far, and then two, is there do you care at all for the tight end position or running back as far as like who you might be trying to attain, or is it just still the same process as always? Pay attention to wire, send spot start type draft capital. Like what are you looking for? What do you what's your thoughts, and what are you looking for in the future for these two positions?
So the thing that you're going to have to really do some searching through for your league. So if you're in a ton of South Harmon leagues, if you've got the King McNutted as your league manager, you don't need to worry about this. But if you've got a trade deadline of week 13, week 14, or even week 12,
Yeah.
you've got to be looking ahead to make sure that you have the running backs in order to fill your spots in your lineup, because you don't get that trade market that you've probably been relying on, where you can send a second for somebody, send a third for someone to get those spot starts filled.
Yep.
And so you're going to have to ask yourself some tough questions on that. And so then on that, let's pull up the WoRP per game.
All right.
Since we're in a lineup league here.
WoRP per game graph.
Yeah. So you can see in this, with this lineup league, our running backs are close to our wide receivers. And so if you compared this to 2022, that running back line is probably above the wide receivers.
Yep.
Here, we're kind of close. And so if I am looking for, hey, what am I going to do to make my playoff run? I want to make sure that I have a solid running back room. Now, if I don't have a trade deadline, I am totally fine going into week 15 going, all right, I need to figure out what this room is going to look like. But if I have a trade deadline before the end of the season, if like right before playoffs, something like that, you have to make some decisions before then. And so that's
correct.
where I'm going to look into what are our matchups for the playoffs.
Okay.
Some good. I'm going to just run down the list of the top 5 teams. Chargers, Atlanta, Philly, Pittsburgh, New England. Top 5 fantasy matchups for running back.
Okay. So when I think about that already, like Eckler for me, because he was hurt again, and maybe because of his age, he has significantly high age for people that just look at that at the running back position, right? At 28, he was someone in a lot of my contenders. If there was a price where he was under a first, let's say, so I could get there with a receiver and a second, or even a couple seconds. Like he was already someone I was trying to purchase. So, like to me, that one seems pretty easy if you can get Eckler as a target.
For sure, it's you trying to get Eckler, but of course Eckler might also be on one of those teams that's in the playoffs because of where he is in age versus dynasty value versus production. So he might be a harder one to get.
And the other one I noticed that, like, when Mike and I just recently ran through after you ran the numbers, DeAndre Swift is on a lot of winning teams too because of where his cost was, right? So that's another tough one. Now, Pittsburgh and New England, the funny part about that is that as a whole, those have been dumpster fires this year for the position, right? Because you have Najee's not been giving you much. Jaylen Warren's not, as far as fantasy goes, you can say whatever you want. He's efficient. He's not getting enough touches, and he's not scoring touchdowns, right? So he's not been meaningful. The Rhino had a nice game recently, but he's been splitting work with Zeke, and that offense has been terrible. So that's intriguing because I think the opportunities are definitely there given the schedule, but will people actually be willing to buy in because it seems so gross. That's what's funny.
Yeah, and there's some worry about that too, in terms of, yes, they have good matchups. How much do we want to buy into that?
For sure.
And I'm not going to go out, kind of like the wide receivers, where I'm not going to go out and say DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett would be the reason that you win your league outright.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go and call that they're going to score you 35 points and you're just going to win a championship off of it.
Mm-hmm.
But they have a good opportunity to score you the 20 points that are going to put you in a position to win as long as your opponent doesn't get the 40-point bomb week.
Yeah.
And in some ways, when you're talking about the head-to-head matchup, you have two ways of winning it. The first one is you have a really good week, and the second one is your opponent has a really bad week.
For sure.
And you kind of have to look into your roster construction and see, how is your team built? Is your team built with a lot of floor options? If that's the case, I kind of want to lean into that and say, all right, the scoring average in my league is 130 points, but I can consistently score 145. That's it. If you consistently score 145, that means that your opponent is going to need to exceed that. And there might be some teams that one week they score 190 and the next week they score 80. And they just might bounce up and down each week. And that might be who you go against in the playoffs. You want to make sure that your team is still putting up that 145. Because if they have an average week and they put up 130, you're going to beat them. But you might also have one of those teams where you're that 190 to 80 team bouncing up and down. You want to lean into that. You want to have those players that are going to have the big weeks or the crash weeks, and just and win either your matchup off of luck or lose it off of luck.
Yeah.
Because ultimately that's what the playoffs come down to, is it's a 1v1 matchup. It comes down to a lot of luck, because of course you can change it up and down, but if you are already banking on luck, lean into it.
Yeah, I think that point there is underrated, especially I think understanding the rest of your league too, right? Because if you're going into the playoffs and you don't have to the point you just made about the 190 to 80, right? And you look at averages. Right now you should be getting close. It may not be completely determined. There might still be 8 teams that have a real shot. But you're getting closer to knowing the number of teams that can sneak in. You can kind of peg out which ones you think are pretenders and contenders. But the reality is I'm paying attention to some of the top-end teams in my league too, because if I'm in a dynasty league, let's say, right, and let's say I'm flirting with getting in the playoffs. Obviously, I just want to make the dance at this point. Like, you're kind of in the position where you don't have a ton of time to reverse it anyway, right? If you see that there is a couple goon squad teams that are both like star-studded and they have high-end potential, to your point. They can hit that 190, 200, but they're also like crushing the league average. They're very consistent, good scoring team. That's where I'm trying to think, okay, to really have a chance to win, I'm going to need to hit more of these upside plays. But I think in a lot of dynasty leagues, you'd be surprised, and this is where you got to pay attention to your specific one. It may not be that spread out yet, or just you've had it for a while, but nobody's really a clear-cut, defined, absolutely unbeatable team. So in that scenario, I think a lot of times the floor of your team is not appreciated enough or talked about enough to the point you just made. So I really like that point.
Yeah, and so you want to, as you're looking through this, also recognize that your running backs are the positions that tend to have a little bit of a better floor for you. and your wide receivers are the ones that have a better ceiling.
Yep.
So if you're looking at a league like this where, hey, that AWARP per game graph is wide receiver and running back are on top of each other, maybe lean into that a little bit. Okay, if I have solid running backs but kind of spotty wide receivers, fill up your flex with more running backs to give yourself the floor. If you have really good wide receivers, fill up your flex with more wide receivers. Overload yourself in that position. And then that also simultaneously helps keep more of that position out of your league mates.
Yeah,
so that
true.
way you have a stronger positional advantage.
Yep. I like that call. Okay, so then with this is we didn't really talk much. At least I didn't hear you talk much about tight ends. Is it the AWARP life still, or is there any players that you're considering at all, or is this I'm just going to completely fade this position? I'd rather invest everything into the other positions and leave tight end what it is.
So if I'm in a lineup league, I'm still playing AWARP life.
Okay.
If I'm in best ball, I've got a couple targets that I'm looking at.
Should we want me to pull up the best ball version of this?
Pull up the best ball version.
All right, let's do that.
It shouldn't be too different, but never hurts.
Nope, we'll pull it up just to make sure. And do you want the AWARP per game graph, or in best ball do you want the which one do you typically
We can do
want?
AWARP per game graph.
All right, that's the one I still look at even in best ball.
Yeah, so if you don't know how AWARP per game works in best ball leagues, it is based on whether a player is rostered, not based on whether a player is started. So you aren't going to get who was it last week for Carolina that caught 4 passes for 60, Steven Sullivan.
Mm-hmm.
You aren't going to get Steven Sullivan showing up in the AWARP per game for a best ball league, but you are going to get basically every other tight end. You're going to get your Durham Smythes and your Irv Smiths and your Hunter Henrys, and probably even Pharaoh Brown is showing up now because he's doing enough in New England. Those guys are still going to show up. So the league where those guys might not show up is like if you're rostering 20. But if you're rostering 20 in best ball, what are you doing?
Yeah, true. Well, I think the big thing too there is using the roster construction tab and having a good idea of and honestly, this is one of the things I've had to I've used the WoRP tool a lot with Koopa, just to, as I have a bunch of teams, making sure that I'm looking, and on the contending teams especially, it actually works both ways for me. If I'm contending, like if I've seen the team contending, needing to make moves there, like constantly combing over this league weekly, making sure, like, okay, if I add 1 or 2 here because that's who's available on the wire, like, I never want to get over and get way out of pocket with the tight end position, right? I want to have enough to fill a spot, but I do not want to have it to where now, like, flex spots are going to potentially be reliant on a tight end very often, right? It's a push and pull thing that I'm paying a lot more attention to on my contenders. Actually, on my rebuilders, though, the nice part is, man, I want to keep as many of them as possible because they're not going to sneak in your lineup very much. And if they do, that means you're probably losing. Good.
Yeah. So going into our tight ends with good matchups, we've got the Arizona tight ends, which right now says Trey McBride. But we have to keep an eye out for Zach Ertz's injury updates.
I was just going to say, though, that to me, honestly, my initial thought actually went to Zach Ertz. Like, Zach Ertz, he's older and hurt. Maybe a super crusty, cheap buy target. I mean, I don't want to pay anything astronomical. You're not going to have to, though, for a guy like him.
Mm-hmm. You might be able to squeak in like a late third or even a 4th-round pick for Zach Ertz somewhere to the right manager who's like, this guy's old, he's getting replaced. I don't know even why you want him, but sure, I'll take a random draft pick for him.
I think, too, especially with – I like talking about some of the down-the-line ones like this because I think it's easier to digest and think about, like, okay, if I was going to send a pick. And I'm not saying I won't do that. I'm absolutely trying to leverage picks where I know I'm now in the position to make the playoffs, right? But one of the things that I really like is because I'll get a lot of offers, Koopa. Well, first of all, everybody does. We get a lot of trash offers, and you figure out, no, there's no deal happening. But sometimes you get deals that are reasonable, or like, I don't mind it, but that's not where I want to be, right? I think keeping as many of these type of names or ideas of players in the back of your mind, because if I can ever, like on a deal that's palatable or I am kind of close to taking, if I could add in Zach Ertz on my side and that is not going to kill the deal, like that's little places that you can really, I think, try to utilize this information in a deal that isn't going to sway someone and scare them off, right?
Yes. And what I am attempting to do here is be like, all right, I want these tight ends that have the opportunity in a best ball league that are not going to cost a huge amount.
Yes.
Because if you're talking in best ball, you want a stack of cheap guys. You want to have like 6 of them, and if you can play matchups, great. And so that's why I'm like, Arizona, they've got great matchups. So keep an eye on Zach Ertz, see whether he's going to be back. And he's got a great matchup. Another team to look out for is the New York Giants. We're talking about, that's also a tight end room that's got some question marks with, is Darren Waller going to be coming back and actually playing well? Are we going to see the Daniel Bellinger show? Who's going to be throwing the football? Like, there's a ton of question marks in these top 2 teams for tight ends.
Well, for sure. And there's also quarterback questions, too, for both of them. Because Kyler, I think, is coming back this week. But I don't know. There's a lot of stuff about Kyler and, you know, the team, if he gets hurt, they have to pay him, all this stuff. But go ahead. I'm sorry. I don't want to cut you off.
But
I'm just adding to the conversation.
That means that, hey, those tight ends are going to be cheap.
Yeah. Yep. Well,
you're going to be able to go ahead and you're going to, if you've got a best ball team, you can go out and get some of those guys without having to break the bank, and you're putting yourself in prime opportunity to have solid or even above average tight end performances in the fantasy playoffs when it matters most.
Love it. Love it. Okay, so are those the 2 primary teams that you saw, or is there anyone else?
Those are the 2 primary teams. If you want to toss Denver and Tennessee into the bucket, you can. But Arizona and New York, especially in week 16 and 17, have really, really strong matchups.
Okay.
But I want to toss out I want to toss out 2 teams here that you might be relying on those tight ends, and you might not be realizing it, but they are going to fall out from under you. The first one is the Jacksonville Jaguars and Evan Ingram. Their week 15, 16, 17 is Baltimore, Tampa Bay, Carolina. And now, you might not think of all of those teams as they shut down the tight ends.
Right.
Baltimore is second worst matchup against tight ends. Carolina is a third worst matchup against tight ends. And Tampa Bay is like kind of middle of the pack. And so you're talking week 15, if you're relying on Evan Ingram to get you to the semifinal round, he's not going to do that for you against Baltimore. Or at least he's not as likely to.
Yeah.
If you're talking, I'm trying to win a championship, going against Carolina week 17, not going to help you out a whole lot there. It's going to be much more difficult for him.
Yeah.
And so that's somebody that has been putting up good numbers, and you might be able to pivot from him to someone else. And maybe you can pivot from him to multiple guys. Maybe you can get some sort of like Chig Okonkwo and David Bellinger and a pick, like something weird like that, where it's like, why are you splitting your Evan Ingram up into all of these different assets? But you're looking at, hey, I know what the playoff matchups are. I think the combination of Chig and Daniel Bellinger are going to be able to match what Evan Ingram puts up, plus I'm getting a bonus pick to allow myself to upgrade somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, man. I was basically yelled at, verbally assaulted on any Chig pushback I gave. Guy's been I think almost worthless, honestly, like as far as a WoRP perspective, right? But at the tight end position in best ball, one of the great parts is if that price dips down at all on any player, right? I'm looking essentially in one of the nice parts, because you just illustrated it by splitting here, is like I don't have to hit you with one tight end like in lineup, right? I actually prefer here to and it's one of my biggest takeaways from this season, some of the stuff we went through with Mind Warp, but really seeing it this year is just kind of overwhelming you with just the right amount of tight ends. They don't have to be the greatest, right? Because even if they're average, very average tight ends or below average tight ends, I'm really probably looking for 2 weeks out of these guys at tops, right? And when we're talking about what we're talking about here, Koopa, if you gave me 1 week in the playoffs, you have done your duty, right? Like that's what I'm looking for. So that one's scary because Evan Ingram is such a has been such a solid and above average tight end. But to your point, you're kind of offsetting some of that with getting an additional pick thrown in there. I was going to ask you this because I think when I start looking at see, like in lineup, not that I don't care. I do absolutely care about schedules and trying to find the correct guys in best ball. In lineup, especially where I have to set my league, though, I'm probably paying a little more attention. Not that I'm not paying attention in best ball, but in best ball, since we have this graph up, one of the things I'm still looking to do, right, is the combination, like you said, of schedule, but also like, are there some sleepers that can be had for cheap in general that have been pretty solid players that I could maybe add in at any of the positions? So has there been any? Let me just ask you if you have any of those off the top of your head, or if there's guys that you've been thinking of at all, just to add to the depths of your team in best ball, right?
So if you are looking at a potential hole in week 15, and I'm talking week 15 only, because I want to be looking at Logan Thomas for the Washington Commanders.
Say that again. Okay.
So Logan Thomas for the Washington Commanders, week 15, has an amazing matchup against the Los Angeles Rams. It's going to be, if I was going to bank on any week I want Logan Thomas to be a top 5, top 3 spike week tight end, it's going to be that week.
Interesting. Okay. I like that one.
However, what does he have in week 16 and 17? New York Jets, San Francisco 49ers.
So your play with him is basically like, if I don't have a buy, or if I'm not in a position to secure a buy, it's okay. But you're probably to the point in 16 and 17 give you nothing.
Yeah. So, but he might be able to get you to that semifinal game where maybe then you have a 50-50 shot of making it to the finals, and then you have another 50-50 shot of winning the whole thing. But it's about just getting yourself through each week one by one.
That's what I was going to say. Okay, good.
A league with no trade deadlines, you might want to play for week 15 and be 100%. Like, I'm going to win week 15 and I'm going to figure it out afterwards. After week 15, then you revamp your team and you go, all right, I'm going to take Logan Thomas, and maybe I can try and poison pill someone. I can give them an offer that they can't refuse of, I'm going to take Logan Thomas and I'm going to toss you a 4th, and you're going to give me back Daniel Bellinger if Darren Waller isn't back.
Okay.
And I'm going to poison pill someone and say, I'm going to steal this tight end off of your roster that I know has good matchups and should not beat Logan Thomas, and play against that for a matchup and toss in the 4th just to get the deal done.
I like that. Real quick, brief interruption. We got a super chat. You always talking about selling tight end in a half-point premium. So would you move LaPorta for a 24-107 and a late 24 second? Koopa, the A-Warp Life. And he says it's a 12-team Superflex. Sean, just to clarify, is this best ball or lineup? I'm imagining lineup right now. If he clarifies with best ball, we can change it. But let's say lineup for right now, Coop. Go ahead. You can take this one.
If it's lineup, I am looking at this 24 class. And specifically, we're looking at, this says 24-107 and late 24 second.
I had a feeling where you're going with this. Go ahead.
I am liking the depth of the 24 class enough that I'm going to say, yes, I would do this. if I knew this was the 25 107, I have listened to enough Campus to Canton pods to know that the 2025 class is very disappointing.
Yeah. As a whole, not a class I'm like looking to put it like this. The 25 class for me right now, we know, like with 22, we've seen enough classes that sound really bad. Like, inherently, there will be some people in there, right? The 25 will produce some people, but the way I play it and the way I value picks and the way I try to move them, especially on contenders, if that class would be one I'd kind of forego a lot of my principles on. Like I'm basically okay if I end up not having to make or not drafting a lot of players in the 2025 class. I would still probably want to keep some for leverage and this and that. But to the point you're making, if you had to keep these picks and draft them, the 107 and 24 for me is you have the top 3 picks, right? If I can get a top 3 pick in 2024, like those are going to be just values when they come into the league. Those are going to be absolutely difference makers, like as far as dynasty values for that whole offseason, 24 top 3 picks. This next tier, though, is like a kind of a jumbled like 104 to 109 type thing. It's not that massive hammer type values of Marvin Harrison Jr., Drake May, and Caleb Williams. But there's a lot of guys in this range. There's a lot of very good receivers in this class, the league neighbors. But 107 also, what's really interesting about this specific pick to me is Brock Bowers is absolutely in this mix, right? And if I just think, I don't think Brock Bowers is going to be tight end 1 out of the jump, right? But I think Brock Bowers, if you think about how much value Kincaid had this offseason, right? Just the hype. Imagine that plus some, because it's Brock Bowers. So he's already going to be into the top 10. Like we know inherently all these guys were top 10. Michael Mayer, Sam LaPorta, Dalton Kincaid were all top 10 tight ends in Dynasty this offseason, just because it's the position. So one of the reasons, Sean, I talk about selling off of a specific guy like Sam LaPorta is he's at tight end 1. He's already valued as high as he's ever going to get. Now, in this half-point tight end premium you mentioned, this is one where we talk about all the time where it's not a high enough premium to really make a huge difference. The half-point tight end premium doesn't mean a lot as far as WoRP goes especially. So, like, I'm looking to move him in a league like this. But at worst here, I'm probably going to be in a position to potentially draft Brock Bowers and a second. And I'm getting off of LaPorta. In a lineup league, the other thing is in a half-point tight end premium, I don't need to have. Look at this graph. This isn't a half-point tight end premium graph, but the point is that premium is not enough to make this line go steeper, right? Look at that graph. You don't need a tight end 1. You don't need to have a great tight end. So just go ahead and liquidate. You don't have to go get Evan Ingram, who's got a poor schedule, but you can get Logan. You can get all kinds of tight ends for a lot cheaper. So in general, in a lineup league, I'd prefer to liquidate these guys anyway. Unless, somehow it was Travis Kelce in year whatever. Even there, I think I would seriously consider taking just this bag of goods and seeing what else I could possibly buy for my team. It's half-point tight end premium.
So just to switch things up a little bit, just because I was sitting here going, I'm curious.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's pull up a half-point tight end premium. Tell
me which one. I'll pull it up right now for the screen.
Let's go to my username
Okay.
because I've got one that I know the settings for. So Koopa Troopa 8.
Okay.
And then the CLD Cinema League.
Right here?
Right,
Okay.
right at the top there. Run that one.
All right. Let's see what we got.
Because this one, I was like, I feel like there's something interesting going on here. And sure enough, I remembered it.
Okay.
1.5 premium is just enough where it's like, they're almost there, but not quite.
Exactly.
But what that means to me is you're looking at 107 and a late 24 second. I might be able to convince somebody in my league to pay something that's higher than 107. The question is how much higher?
Yeah.
For LaPorta.
Right.
And the question is how much higher? And the 24 seconds to me
It is lineup, by the way. He confirmed in chat.
It is lineup. So 24 second is like, yeah, that's nice, but it's not great because if this was best ball, like, okay, that 24 second can actually mean something. Mm-hmm. Lineup, it's kind of harder to hit back there and actually have somebody that's useful that's going to make an impact to your team.
Yep.
I might be a little hesitant to make this trade, assuming your WoRP graph looks like this. And this is kind of where you have to look at your specific league.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm looking at, okay, Sam LaPorta is probably what, number 4? He's actually number 7 on this graph. So if you're comparing that to where's the corresponding wide receiver, it's like, yeah, I'm looking at getting a top 12 wide receiver back, a top 11 quarterback, a top 10 running back. Like, those guys are what he is matching this year.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing to consider is, where was Sam LaPorta after the first 5 weeks of the season? When did I do that show that I think it was after 5 weeks, where I came on here and said, I think Sam LaPorta might be the Dynasty tight end 1 here in the near future.
Yeah.
And the next week he was. What has he done since then? He hasn't knocked the world around. He's done okay, but he hasn't been the Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews competitor that he was the first couple weeks.
So okay. And I think, here's the thing. Like, when you look at a guy like LaPorta, the thing is, for me, with a guy like him, right, you just look at the way he plays, the amount of snaps he's playing. Like, for a rookie tight end, you could not really want a whole lot more, right? As far relative, when I say rookie tight end, you couldn't see something that much better. Go back to Kyle Pitts' year, maybe. Like, you're talking the greatest seasons out there. Like, he's playing absolutely awesome for a rookie, but one of the things is now his tight end, his price is getting to the tight end 1 discussion, right? And it's not that Sam LaPorta, first of all, he's a rookie, so he's 7 in WoRP this year. Do I expect him to be one of the guys that's a WoRP difference maker in the playoffs? It's possible. He's that good, sure. But I think the question you have to ask yourself is, with Sam LaPorta, do you see this guy, like, because he's playing so well as a rookie is the reason his value is way up. But do we actually see him being a weekly, week in, week out monster? Like, that's the difference between Andrews and Kelce, really, from the field, right? When you talk about what they are as players for your team in fantasy, part of what they both offer ceilings, they both offer floors, and they're very consistent. Like, that's the difference. So Sam LaPorta, like, long term, I think he's going to be a very good tight end in the NFL. He's going to probably be a great tight end, but is he going to be a WoRP monster? I don't know. I don't know that I can really say that that's the answer to the question. And in this type of a league, here's the thing, Koopa, for me. In general with tight ends, unless my bet is Sam LaPorta is going to be one of the 2, 3, 4 guys, whatever you think that number will be, in the next 2 or 3 years, that's going to matter, like absolutely beat the rest of the field, I don't want to have dynasty value stored in that type of a thing.
Yeah, and the thing that you run into that is really scary is, look at Kyle Pitts. Where has he gone in 2 years of okay tight end usage and okay performance? After knocking it out of the park in year 1, he's gone to nothing.
Yeah.
And you have to understand it with LaPorta as well, that's a very real possibility in terms of the Lions right now. He's essentially their second wide receiver.
Yep, he's their second best option in the offense. I mean, well, obviously Jahmyr Gibbs coming along could definitely be that, but as far as just pass catchers only, he's second. Yeah. certainly second right now. Maybe would be third with Gibbs. But the point is, to your point, you don't know how the room is going to change with weapons. One thing I can say, at least, like the way this team is trending and Campbell, right? There was a coaching change, and it's been awful for Kyle Pitts. Like, we know that Campbell loves LaPorta. This is his guy. So, like, that part at least is nice, and that the team's doing well, so I would expect Campbell to be around for at least a few years. So, like, to your point, though, the situation's changed, year in and year out, and I love LaPorta, man. I really do. It's just the problem is his price in Dynasty, I think in a league like this, does not make sense. Now, to the point you just made, if we go back to really get the super chat and get back to the other stuff we're talking about, I think you could possibly see if you can get the second upped, right? I would already, if I make this trade and I have this second in my bag now, I'm basically, what can I attach this to make a deal to go right back into the discussion we're having earlier. What can I now buy when I attach a late 24-second to something? That's what I'm trying to do if I was to take this. But if you can, take a look at the guy's team, pull an ATM, right? You got this offer out there. Can I add something in? Can I swap that second out for a similar value that I'd rather have? So I think you can do all those type of things. I think in general the value and offer makes sense. However, if you want to tweak it or you're able to move that second around for something else, to Koopa's point, you should be able to do that because LaPorta is so valuable. And if you have an offer like this for this, right? The one thing is if you have an offer like this for LaPorta, someone's probably willing to pay for their man. So you can probably tweak it a touch. Go ahead, sorry.
An idea here for you, Sean. If you've been living the WoRP life, you should not have many tight ends behind LaPorta on your team either. You should be pretty bare there. So Can you maybe snag the tight end from this team that's selling you the 107 in a second because they're going to be like, oh, I don't need this tight end anymore because I've got LaPorta to put in my lineup. Maybe Thomas. You can take that tight end and slot him right in. Maybe it's a Logan Thomas. Maybe it's a Hunter Henry. Maybe it's somebody like that.
Yep.
Just slot that guy right in.
Yeah, Gerald Everett. Whoever. I mean, if they have a tight end that has a pulse, has a chance to hit some consistent and possibly a random spike week, add him in, man. Who is the QB at the end of it? Watson. Is that Watson at the end?
No, it is not. It is a guy at the name of Aaron Rodgers, who went out and scored a fat 0 in 1 week, scored negative .094 WoRP, and has never played again this season.
Got hurt on the first play. Was it a turnover then?
I don't think it was a turnover. I think it was just an incomplete pass. So he got a 0.
So he got a 0.
WoRP of a quarterback. It's that 0 is like you missed the mark by 12 points or whatever.
Yeah.
And he's never played since then to bring it back to reasonableness.
Yeah.
Because he's out for the season.
No, for sure. So he has one play, which counts for a full game in the way that the WoRP is run. So then his number is going to stay down here for eternity.
Especially in WoRP because he was started that week by a ton of people.
Yeah.
So
in Superflex leagues,
he's never going to be started again.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. All right, so I was trying to remember. That was a good. Thanks for the super chat, by the way, Sean. Appreciate it. Any super chats will always answer. I kind of forget where we were going with the. I think we were talking about not just tight ends now. We were talking about buys in general, players that you might be trying to buy in best ball and add to your teams based on the combination of schedule and guys that maybe are performing decently in WoRP look like they might continue to do that for the rest of the year.
Yeah. It's like some other things that guys that you might want to look at where value's a little repressed, but they'll be able to have some good matchups towards the end of the season.
Okay.
You've got Russell Wilson.
He's got let's go,
the
man.
number 2 best matchup. If you're talking a best ball quarterback who might be able to toss you a spike week, Russell Wilson, he has it in him to be able to do it. The question is, can he do it in Denver? But if there's going to be a time to do it, you'd want it to be during the fantasy playoffs, and he's got a great 3-week stretch of Detroit, New England Chargers, and that comes out to the number 2 average points allowed to the quarterback.
Yep.
And he hasn't done a whole lot this season. His value has been kind of down because it's like, hey, he hasn't been doing as well as we want him to.
Yeah.
So
he's been he started actually pretty hot. Lately he's been, I would say, like a floor play, right? Like in best ball, I guess. Like he's been okay. But it's, if you look at like true WoRP versus, so he's quarterback 16 in true WoRP. He's quarterback 20 in WoRP, a WoRP per game. So basically kind of showing you in the early weeks, he might have won you some weeks, but he's been just pretty mid. And that's fine to add teams in best ball, honestly. But to your point, you might be able to add him who's really gross and not that awesome of a player. A lot of people are actually pretty off of Russell Wilson and want to sell. So if you could buy at that price of very mid or below mid, and then you have some schedules that give you some upside, I like that purchase. So
now I'm going to toss out something really bizarre here.
Okay.
All right. I want to put out that the number 7 matchup that we have is Tennessee. They have the 7th best.
Levis?
And then we have the 5th best at Geno Smith with the Seattle Seahawks. They've also have a great matchup.
Okay.
I talked earlier how Miami has the worst matchup for QBs in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
In a best ball league, if you're sitting there riding Tua so far this season, I would hazard you to go out and try and see if you can get 2 of the 3 of Russell Wilson, Will Levis, Geno Smith. And maybe depending on how your league values Tua, how scared they are of the past injury history, because I know that still plays into his value some. If you get 2 of those guys, you might give yourself 2 quarterbacks that are going to play better than Tua in the playoffs. In which case, you can cover for your other quarterback if he has a down week. Or one of those 2 might hit a spike week. Like we saw Will Levis hit a spike week, 2 weeks ago, where he threw for 4 touchdowns.
He's only started 2 games, and he's got a spike week. And I would say his other week was not a consistent week, but he at least showed me some stuff in that game, given the pressure he was under, and that makes me think there's some better days ahead for him. I like those calls. I also definitely always like in best ball trying to add as many quarterbacks to the mix as possible. So if you could get 2, that's a good one. I was just gonna say it's interesting you brought up Tua, because I think I was gonna ask you a couple questions on schedules, and then what are just our possible thinking, move, hold, sell, buy. Okay, so like what does the schedule look like for quarterbacks? Let's say because Trevor Lawrence is still very highly valued in Dynasty, but has not been the greatest. So like what does the Jags look like for quarterbacks?
Second worst.
It's
Baltimore, Tampa Bay, Carolina.
It's interesting because I saw his schedule wasn't great. I didn't look over the entire thing that gives you how bad it was and good it was. Just like you can see in Sleeper, right? The red and the orange and the green or whatever. Like Trevor Lawrence has a very high Dynasty value. I'm not telling you in Dynasty not to be in on Trevor Lawrence, for the record. I've actually been defending him some this year. But if you could, I think in best ball, if you can extract top 8 quarterback out of T-Law, where you can go get, a much cheaper option at QB, or if you're already flush, you could just liquidate into players. I think that's a guy to consider in best ball, especially if you can get real top high-end money out of T-Law for the push.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not looking to just get off of him and not have a good quarterback situation back. So can I get if I go to Geno, let's say, or one of these other guys, Russell Wilson, Levis, they're all uncertain futures, right? If I'm going there, I need to add some of these, probably at minimum 2 of these receivers that I think are going to help me. Or can I get a 4 for 1 or some shit? Like if you can do stuff like that in best ball, I think it would make sense. Go ahead. What were you going to go to?
So I wanted to call out one other person that is somebody you might have been relying on and not realizing it.
Okay.
And is Sam Howell.
Well,
so
dude, you should be realizing it. He has been a top 10 QB in some formats for the last 5 weeks.
Yes. But he doesn't really have a ton of dynasty value to correspond with it.
Correct.
And I want to call out Cody from the Fantasy Draft Room, because he this week said Sam Howell is one of his sneaky buys. And I agree in terms of a long-term play. What I am worried about is the end of this season, that they are ending week 16 against the Jets and week 17 against the 49ers.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that in the schedule.
That I am hesitant to say, you know what, I'm my sneaky playoff quarterback, I'm going to grab Sam Howell because he's been doing great and I might be able to buy him for cheap. I would caution you against that to try for scoring your points to try and go there, just because he's got a really, really bad matchup for the 2 weeks that are the most important.
They are rough. The one thing I was gonna say with all of this conversation, especially, like, I think this should be the making the push for the title, right? And this should be something that you absolutely keep in mind and try to fine-tune your roster construction, fine-tune your team to go win the money. That's the whole idea. And I'm willing to honestly, if I think it gives me a much better or a better chance to win, I will forego some of dynasty value in the future to try to win right now. But I do think the one thing, like when we think about all of this in mind, you want to do a little bit of this type stuff where you are really pushing your chips in and making bets on stuff for the playoffs. But it's a blend, right? You don't want to like go crazy on this where you're just focused on winning the. So like for example with Howe, I think Howe right now, he's a great buy, I think, relative to cost still. If there's anyone out there that's thinking, oh well, Sam Howell's had these great weeks, I'll sell high, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, that's good. And the one to the point you're making, right? I would not be trying to add him in with the idea that he's going to be the person individually that wins it for you in the playoffs. But like if we play best ball and lineup, that's where it's very different for me because I'm with you 100%. But in best ball, at least I might be able to say, hey, he can help me get in. He can probably even have a good week 15. I mean, he played really well versus Philly. I know that they typically play well versus them, actually, more than people think. So he could still have some down weeks there, but that's where I think you have to say, okay, if I have Sam Howell on my team already now, or I'm purchasing Sam Howell, what are some other quarterbacks? We talked about some of those. So I think in best ball, making sure you have enough options at quarterback is a big thing. And, if you're doing it where you don't have a lot and you're going to only purchase Sam Howell to try to patch that room together to the point you just made, that could end up being where your Superflex spot doesn't have a very pretty score in it, in best ball.
Yeah, but it also could be, hey, this is somebody that if you're trying to get yourself to a better playoff position,
right? Exactly.
Maybe you're that third overall team, and you're like, I have a shot at being second and getting a bye week.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is also very important, and that's somebody that you could go and actually target for that. 100%. But what you don't want to do is say, I am first overall or I am sixth overall, and this is how I'm going to make it through the playoffs is by adding this guy. Yep. Because that is just a trap waiting to happen.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where I think it's a blend, right? Because it's not like we're already in the playoffs to the point you just made. Like you still have to worry about making sure you check all the boxes to get in and secure the spot you need. So I think Sam Howell can absolutely still do that. He's shown enough for me right now, and I think the team is going to be in a position, a good enough position that even when they turn everything over, like I don't know that they can just say, Sam Howell, you're gone. So he's I would say he's, to your point, like long term and even for the rest of this push to get to the playoffs. But just understand that there may be a much lower floor and much lower ceiling for him in the playoff parts. Okay, let me ask you this then. Is there any other quarterbacks you wanted to discuss or that were in the discussion that makes sense? That it?
Those are all the quarterbacks. Really high highs, really low lows. Everyone else is kind of like vaguely in the middle, or you know what you're going to get. Baker Mayfield's going to have some bad matchups. Joe Burrow's going to have some bad matchups. You weren't really relying on those guys too much anyway, though.
Yeah. What about okay, so then let's talk about one of the things. I'll get to this for the running back position, but with receivers, okay? Because I think the way to really look at this is going to be, for me, kind of, I don't want to always use last year, right? Because or a single year, but I do like to use history in general. Quarterback and receiver for me anyway, Koopa, are some of the ones where, in particular, like if I can lock someone in, I like to do that, even in best ball, because I'm getting a guy that just adds. Look, if I can add a body that I didn't priorly have, right? Or if I can split guys and I get two that are meaningful, that's what I want to do in best ball leagues. So, but the receiver and the quarterback position especially, because at running back, see, there's still so much uncertainty before the playoffs are around the corner for that position. It's not that I won't buy running backs. It's not that I won't. But you go back and look at last year, and the names that helped win people leagues at running back, right, and even at tight end, Evan Ingram was one. he was okay. He didn't do a ton though until towards the end of the year. Jerick McKinnon and Cam Akers were two of the top running backs, and they literally had done almost nothing all year. So if I was to just make investments, quarterback that we just kind of went over, and then I was going to go over wide receiver with you too. If you had wanted to kind of go top to bottom on position for the guys that, cost worth paying up, or they're sneaky buys, they're kind of dirt cheap. Because if I can get those guys now and then continually keep my eye on the running back position as we get closer to the playoffs, that's ideally how I'd like to do it.
Yeah, if you're investing early now, you want to go into quarterback and receiver, and your running backs. That's what I was saying. You got to pay attention to when your league's trade deadline is, or just hope you don't have one, because you're going to have to. If you do have a trade deadline, you're going to have to make that decision too early, and you're going to have to take your best guess as to what is going to happen in the playoffs, and you're going to be stuck with the variance.
And that's where, the one thing I will say, all right, if you can buy a running back that you really believe in and it's at a reasonable enough or below value price, I'm not going to tell you you can't do it. But right now, especially, what I would prefer not to do is actually start investing significant high draft capital. If I can buy cheap guys at running back, late second types, mid second types, stuff a third, couple thirds. You could. The problem even there is opportunity cost, but you're not if you're not blowing all your chips, that's one thing. But what I don't want to do, especially, is typically send a first round pick on a running back that I think is highly discounted and going to be awesome because he could get hurt, and now you don't that value goes significantly down, or he may just underperform. Maybe there's other guys that are much cheaper options I could have had later. So that's the reason I say all that. But okay, receivers. What do you got for receivers for us?
So receivers, if we're looking at where might be some good matchups, I already mentioned Seattle at the beginning.
Yep.
San Francisco for weeks 15 and 17 are amazing matchups. They have Baltimore in the middle, which is going to be rough. But if you can potentially ride out week 16, if you've got a stable of other wide receivers, that's maybe a spot that you want to go to. Go get your Brandon Aiyuk, maybe Deebo Samuel's around. I'm not 100% on where his injury is going to be and how he's going to come back from it and all those sorts of things, but maybe you're looking there. Number 4 is kind of interesting to me because of the perception of him, and it is the New York Jets. And so can you maybe get Garrett Wilson for weeks 15 and 16? Week 17 is against the Cleveland Browns. That's going to be a crapshoot, and it's going to go horribly for him.
Right.
But weeks 15, I have a league where I have Garrett Wilson, and I know this league is super active, and I know there's no trade deadline. So I am going to my plan is to ride Garrett Wilson to weeks 15 and 16, and then go, this is a young wide receiver with a lot of dynasty value. Hey, right before week 17 in championship game, I'm going to trade Garrett Wilson for a stable of old, crusty wide receivers to try and win this championship 1v1.
Well, the other part about I like that is, I'm not really, when I'm in the playoffs, I'm all for winning it, right? I'm not even thinking about what happens if I lose. But, for example, if you ended up if somehow you went up against the ridiculously high-scoring team, now week 17 you're not in the title or something, okay, well, you got Garrett Wilson, you're okay. But I like that play because it's really it's out there. I think a lot of people would be like, man, that seems kind of crazy. If you get into the playoff game or the championship game, though, you're already in the money, right? The second place, and you have a chance to win it. Sometimes, go make a move. Especially if you could actually get a realistic tear down where you're getting 4 shots, and that could be the piece that helps you win. We have all the playoff. We have no deadlines for the playoffs, right? In the South Harmon League, so I have seen so many trades made in the playoffs that significant size, middling size, seemingly insequential, and guess what? A lot of those are little needle movers that help a team win the 1 or 2 games they need to in the title. So actually, one of the leagues I won last year, we had a lot of injuries last year. It's a up to 3 quarterback league. So it's a quarterback and 2 super flexes. Man, I already had injuries. I have Jalen Hurts get hurt. I'm like, man, like we're supposed to have 3 quarterbacks out here, and I have 1 right now. Like I can't do this. And I was able to get Dak and Dimes for Jalen Hurts, and I'm like, this is just because I think I have a chance to win the money. It's a no-brainer, and I ended up winning the money. If I wouldn't have won, it would have kind of sucked. But given the way that league goes, I made a move like that. So if you know that about your league, I think pre-planning and having ideas to make trades amidst the playoffs to help win it is a good idea. Okay, so you mentioned the Jets. I know you already mentioned Seattle, and you mentioned Frisco. The only thing, like Frisco is tough because Aiyuk is obviously someone you should be wanting to buy anyway, right? Not that I wouldn't pay market price for Brandon Aiyuk if I needed to. But then the Debo thing, like you guys know I'm not the biggest Debo guy, but at the same time, he showed well early, but there's injuries and this offense is still a little unstable. I think it's very much could be anyone's week. Debo isn't been secure and he's been hurt. I'm not saying I wouldn't purchase Debo, but like outside of those two, maybe in best ball you add all the ancillary pieces too when you can on the wire, right? Like I think that's another way to grind edges in best ball is if you see stuff like that, try to add some other pieces. But the reality is this offense is so consolidated between 4 options, right? Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, Brandon Aiyuk, Debo. So there's really 2 receivers I'm interested in, and then the rest of the room I don't. For free off waivers, sure, but I don't care really much past that. So is there any other ones or any other players? Let me ask you, is there any players, not necessarily schedule, any players that have surprised you this year or you think might be able to continue the success they've stayed, in the helping teams win bucket?
The ones that are the one that surprised me that he's doing as well as he has been George Pickens. Like I thought he was going to regress a lot.
Yeah. He's coming off an absolutely scary game, negative yardage, right? But he's been very good in WoRP overall. I'm with you on this one.
Overall, he's been able to put up good performances that aren't a 3 weeks of 2 for 17 and then 1 week of 4 for 90 and 2 touchdowns.
Correct.
Like I thought that's the kind of player he was going to be. And he's been pretty consistent, obviously beyond the week of negative yards.
Yeah.
But overall, he's been pretty consistent, and it's been surprising to me, like just how well he's done overall. And I think that there might be, it hasn't really tanked his value like we thought it might, but it also hasn't really spiked his value too high. That he's
Correct.
Like an unattainable wide receiver.
No, and I think Pickens is one of those where in best ball especially, I think I would be interested. I think the thing with him though is it's all really going to come down to, because he's kind of in that middle range, right? Like he's got a hot enough name that he might cost too much. He's got but he's also WoRP wise and what his role looks and projects to be the rest of the year. He's in could be meaningful for you in a team. So I think a lot of it's going to come probably down to my league market. Like, what does he cost me? Who has him? If I have him and I'm selling him, I better be getting 2 pieces back that are solid. I think. What was the one I was going to mention? Oh, it's always kind of forgotten, and he's been consistent. I know the schedule's not the greatest for Sam Howell in the playoff run, so there's that to consider. But like Terry McLaurin is just one of these guys that, like, if you have a rebuilder that has McLaurin or someone that's just meh on him, he's just always consistent. So, like, I don't know. I guess I care about that a lot more in best ball because I want to have 7-8 guys that weekly have a chance to get me there. And McLaurin has been one that just, I don't know. He's kind of at this point become an old name. People are tired out, but keeps producing for my fantasy teams, and he doesn't have crazy high upside, but he's shown plenty of top 15 weeks. So that's a guy I really want to.
And if there's a Mike Evans floating around on a non-contender or a fringe contender, go snag that up.
That's a great call.
But he's also somebody that if he's not already on one of those teams, what is that manager doing?
Yep.
Why hasn't he been moved?
And he sells for you. Wide receivers, quarterbacks. We can get into other positions if we need to.
So, the guys that I'm worried about, the one that I'm worried about the most is Jahan Dotson, because he's been getting outproduced by the number 3 wide receiver, which has mostly been Curtis Samuel, but even Jamison Crowder had a week.
Yeah, he did.
Where he spiked up, and I'm sitting there waiting for Jahan Dotson to have those Jalen Waddle style weeks where he just comes out and he just absolutely smokes the whole field.
Mm-hmm.
And I just haven't seen that out of him.
Yeah.
And so I'm just worried for, is he ever going to reach the ceiling that we kind of had him valued at and where he'd been holding, or should he really be one of those you talk about top 50 wide receivers, guys you want in your team, he's still in that bucket, but I think he's much closer to the fringe than we want to really talk about.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think that's a good call. I mean, the nice part, at least about Dotson, because he was playing so terrible, right, for the start of the year. He's had a couple of solid enough weeks that maybe, you can get off of him actually again, right, if you had him. I'm not going to say, in best ball, I don't care at all about him. He's a best ball receiver for me at this point. But I think the name is high enough, too, especially where even let's say you had a harder time selling him, you can in best ball typically still get deals done whenever you want for a name like that are, a 3-for-1 and they're all kind of crusty. You feel like you're burning up Jahan Dotson, but you can definitely sell a name like that for something. Okay, and then I was just going to ask you any final thoughts here. WoRP in general, we talked about the receivers for those that are catching this part later right now live, or it's a while ago now, an hour and 22 in. The receivers at the top in the receiver position in general versus 2022 of last year versus 2023 this year, that's the big jump. The receivers, especially the high-end ones, are carrying teams. The quarterbacks outside of Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen really are not living up to probably the hype you paid or you were hoping for going into the year. And because the wide receivers are smashing so much, unless you're in a heavy weighted scoring to a running back position or a tight end, the receivers in a lot of standard PPR leagues are just making the other positions that much less valuable in WoRP. So those are kind of the highlights for me for this year's WoRP. So I was going to ask you any final thoughts, running through any points you made prior or expounding upon those before we leave.
Make sure that before you go and follow that, hey, I'm going to get all the wide receivers advice, go look up your league on the WoRP tool. Because as we talked about earlier with the super chat, we pulled up that 1.5 tight end premium that I have, and it suddenly became a lot murkier whether we wanted to take that deal for the tight end. Even though we ultimately said, yes, we're going to, it wasn't as slam dunk as if it had been this league that we're staring at right now. And
100%.
There's some leagues that I have where I was like, running back was worth a lot more than the wide receiver last year, and let me check and see where it's at this year. And yeah, wide receiver still doesn't match the running back, but it's maybe a little bit closer, but it's just still not quite there. And so you just have to go through, make sure, do the analysis on each of your leagues. Don't say, as a general principle across all of my leagues, I'm going to focus in on the wide receivers, because that's where you get lazy, and that's where you find yourself falling into a trap that you hamper yourself in all of your fun leagues that you care about with the crazy scoring, and you put yourself on the back foot.
Great call. And that I was trying to preface with saying, if it's just standard PPR. If you watch a lot of this, hopefully you know, or you're at least following along, understanding the concept. If you want to get this tool, you don't have it. South Harmon, ff.com, and then /WoRP. It's $6.90 a month, especially for these last 2 months playoff push, man. Go get that tool. You can get all this information, this graph, all the different stuff from it for your league, specifically to your league. So to the point you were making, right? I have a league off the top of my head that I just know. I've seen in a lot of these graphs. I look at them quite often now. I know this one especially is going to highlight the point that you're making that you have to think about. Like here, this league, right? Now this graph is closer for the receivers than it was last year. So the information is going to still be there. Like the wide receivers are playing better than they were last year. So for example, Tyreek Hill, right, is not the number 1 in WoRP, but he's basically right there with the top quarterback and running back in this league. But you can tell this league, look at the lines. So the line here, the running back line, is right there with the elite quarterbacks, and then at position 11 and 12 takes over for a while as the position you want to have, right? What you can tell though is that the receivers, that you want to just keep stacking receivers at the end. But if you applied the principle that I just talked generically about in PPR leagues to this specific dynasty league, you would be making bad deals, right? Because you can see that the running backs and quarterbacks at the high end are what drive this league. So great point. I think the WoRP tool is awesome for that though. If you're not sure, like if you know it's a pretty vanilla PPR league, that is the principle, right? But any type of tweaks, if you have, you have a crazy amount of roster spots or starters, you're not sure, this will spit it out for you exactly. So I think that's a good mid-season WoRP discussion, as well as preview and prepare to go win your leagues. Is there anything you wanted to run through since we're talking about this at the end here with WoRP, as far as showing people how to get the most out of the tool real quick? Or
Yeah, so let's just go through really quick, because especially with this being a best ball league.
Yep.
Let's do something a little bit fun here. Let's change our weeks slider to weeks 1 through 3.
Okay.
All right. And I'm choosing weeks 1 through 3 because run it, and because there's no teams on bye. All right. Because that's going to be important, because weeks 15 through 17 there's no teams on bye. All right.
Good
now
call.
let's go to our roster construction tab.
Okay. Roster construction. True or adjusted?
Let's go to true.
Okay.
All right. This is the ideal roster construction for playoffs.
Yep.
This is what you want to be looking at for your team, and how many of each position are going to appear. That is it. Notice that if you compare this to a full season's worth, when we compare a full season's worth, we're going to see that droppable number is like 0. Or if it's not 0, it's only like 1 or 2.
Let me run it so you can see. Just and to clarify, just think about this as I'm going to pull these up. The numbers here currently for 1 through 3 are 2.8, 5, 3.6, 7.42. Right. I'll go ahead and run the 1 through 9 now so you can see the differences. But this is actually a pretty good point you're making here. I like this. There you go. Now, so we went from 2.8 to 3.5. The running back numbers changed. They all changed a bit. So the droppable went from 14 to 7 to 7. Is that right?
Yes. And as the season goes on longer, that droppable is going to keep going down. I'm sure if you do the full year of 22, it's going to be way less.
Okay.
And keep that in mind for playoff. That what you are the ideal roster construction you're shooting for to try and win the league does not need to perfectly match the season long. You need to play into what is available for you, whether that's on waivers, whether that's who's willing to deal with you, and you don't need to perfectly match the roster construction. We can let it get out of whack as the season goes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it make sure you're hitting them, especially in a best ball, make sure you're hitting the minimum amounts of, hey, these are the number of players that are going to be on my team and make my lineup. And make sure that you have good enough players that match that roster construction. But you can let that droppable number get a little bit out of whack. If you have if you find that it's easier to get yourself some better running backs than better wide receivers, it's fine to do that. If you find yourself, hey, I need to overload on tight ends a little bit. Maybe I'm not as confident in the guys that I have. Like, overload on tight ends. Like, go pick up those Tanner Hudsons or the what was it? That Carolina tight end.
Sullivan.
Yeah, Steven Sullivan. Like, go pick up those guys. Let yourself get a little bit out of whack and heavy in the tight end position because you're trying to shoot the shots of who's going to get some work. And so go for that sort of thing to try and help yourself win a championship.
Yep.
Because ultimately that's the mode we're moving into. Is you don't need to be prepared for 17 weeks. You need to be prepared for 3 weeks, and then 2 weeks, and then 1 week. That's all you care about.
So this brings me to the last point I'll make, and then we can roll. If there's something that comes to mind for you in capturing a title, feel free to let me know before we dip. So the point you just made, let me just go ahead and go back. So you saw this number. I'm going to go back to 3. All right. Let me run this to 3, drag the slider, and you'll see that. And I think, all right, there's a couple things that I want to talk through here. Right now, like I still have some teams that are out of whack, right? As far as how they're rostered in their rosters, my roster construction looks like to the tool, right? And I know there's probably a few little inefficiencies. Now, that's not necessarily like I'm not saying that you should be doing that. You should be every week trying to have your team as optimal as possible. But in the regular season, 1 week in the regular season, what that's going to do is potentially keep you out of the playoffs. Okay, that's what that's going to do. When you get into the playoffs, right? To the point you make here with this number, this droppable. It's interesting that it's this way, and this has nothing to do with the reason this number is being spit out, I don't think, anyway. But right now it's saying 15 droppable people. And I think as you get to the playoffs, one of the things you have to think about is, at least the way I'm viewing this, I'm going to tell you my approach, and this has kind of been where this tool helps me kind of confirm some of my priors. What I'm going to use this as, and the guide for me in the playoffs with this, and best ball especially, what I need to know here, I need to hit these minimums, period. That's what I'm going to use this for. So I'm not going in, like I'm going to have 3 quarterbacks essentially, right? I'm going to have six running backs. I'm going to go ahead and probably I could maybe in this league have 3 tight ends if I have a bunch of other really good players. I'm going to hit these minimums, and then the reality of that why I'm going to use that as the guide, because then this droppable number to me is kind of the reality. I'm just making sure, listen, I want to have the best players overall in the most depth. But you need to go in, and in the playoffs especially, gut your roster as far as checking it and making sure if you are holding a tight end that has an outside chance at some value, he's gone. Like, the droppable number is the reason is it's the guys that have any ability to hinder you from getting in and out of your lineup, they need to go. And in that week, if you've done and explored every other opportunity, any guy that has a chance to get on the field needs to come into your team. Like, you would be shocked. Go back and look. Trent Irwin. There are names every single year that you are just they don't matter. Like we could look at this chart all across week 1 through 9, and you won't even see the guy. You will not see that guy on any WoRP chart, and all of a sudden he's helping you win a week. So make sure in best ball you're turning that roster, especially at the bottom end, over weekly. And if there literally could be a guy that helped you win last week, and if his role's changing this week, he's back on the wire, and you're filtering in with another guy. So, especially in best ball with the roster construction, I'm in the playoffs. It goes to, for me, I'm making sure I'm hitting the minimums I need to hit at minimum, and then the rest need to be bodies. That's the way I'm kind of viewing my team for the playoff push there. Any thoughts on that?
I totally agree with that. And yeah, hit these minimums and then fill the rest with guys with opportunity. It might be that the guys that you can get with opportunity are running backs. It might be wide receivers. It might be tight ends. It might be quarterbacks. but it doesn't matter who it is as long as it has opportunity.
Correct.
And just recognize that your season-long roster construction goals that you started the year with do not need to be what you're trying to match up with now.
Exactly. And I'll say, I kind of already made this point, but just to go a little further, like I talked about dropping, easy tight end guys. I think you need to have honest discussions with yourself higher up the line too. If you're holding a guy, okay, if you're holding a player on a best ball team, because the shallower lineup, like the shallower rosters, there's some out there. I play in 25 in one of them. I've seen one out there that was like 20, and I'm like, wow, this changes the game a lot. Regardless, though, I don't care if you have 40. Like any player you have that has, let's say, no value is going to be easy to cut. But let's say you're holding a dynasty value guy that's either hurt or, isn't really playing much, but you're like, man, there's a guy here that has some value. Like you need to have honest discussions with yourself about why that's the case now, right? So, and understand your playoff deadline, to Koopa's point, okay? Because let's say you have a, Rashad Bateman type. Let's say you have a injured running backs. Like there's all kinds of injured running backs. You're holding out for J.K. Dobbins. You shouldn't be. But let's say it's higher than that. Why keep that player? If you just can't move him, you can't move him. And then if you get to the playoffs, you can consider moving them. But try to trade those assets now, I think, before the deadline if you have one. And I'll be honest with you. To win a title, I've cut some people that probably have third, even maybe late second round value, tried to trade them in spots to make sure that I'm giving myself every opportunity to win a best ball league. It's very different than in lineup, but this is the best ball principle in roster construction I wanted to highlight real quick.
For sure, and especially if you're playing on Sleeper, you don't have those IR spots to stash those IR players.
Correct.
If you're sitting there waiting on Zach Ertz to come back to be your fourth tight end, if you're on the outside of the first round bye, you should be getting rid of Zach Ertz and turning it into somebody that has a chance to do something.
All right, now
stuff like that.
Now I wanted to do this. I should have done it sooner, but we'll do it now. All right, so I'm going to run the numbers here for 2022 in this league. It's already up, and this is going to be at least if you watch this whole thing, this will be the end result to show you last year's some of the stuff that mattered and didn't matter, and why you should be caring about this, right? Because you look at this, okay, Koopa. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut out the. You can do this on the side right over here. By the way, everybody, you cut out the lines you don't want to see, right? So I'm going to cut out quarterback, wide receiver, and tight end for now. Okay, so I'm going to look at the running backs here. You can do this on the true graph too, but you got Jacobs, McCaffrey was up here, Eckler, Henry, Saquon. This stuff here, though, these numbers, they tell you what that player's win over replacement player was for the whole year, right? This is 1 through 17, right? This is great. This information shows you how valuable they were for your team. But understand, the only absolute thing that fucking matters at all for who wins the title, other than those teams got to the playoffs potentially, is who did what between 14 and 17. All right, so I'm going to run this number here. And the point that I'm going to make is a couple things. But there's going to be some running backs that absolutely probably smash them both. Like I know McCaffrey's going to probably be one here because I had McCaffrey one. McKinnon's two, though. Okay, so Jerick McKinnon was the second most valuable running back to the league, this league, to probably almost universally, to winning titles, right? Because you can if you plug him in, like he's 0.85 during 3-week stretch. He didn't do anything for you all the earlier part of the year. You didn't necessarily even have to have him on your roster, but if you picked up McKinnon and you add it to a team that's already in the playoffs, that's a league winning type move, right? Like that's part of the thing you're looking for. Eckler had a great season. Henry did. James Conner, running back 5. Cam Akers, RIP, he's out for the year. But the point isn't the player specifically. It's the idea that you could pick up an Akers. You could pick up Jerick McKinnon in these spots. Najee Harris, Algier wasn't expensive. Josh Jacobs and Saquon were there. So while these guys cost, Josh Jacobs cost, Saquon Barkley's cost, and their value to the team was very good throughout the whole year, if you didn't have those guys and you added McKinnon or Akers or guys on this list that were cheaper at the right time, doesn't matter. And you didn't have to pay up nearly as much. So I don't know if Koopa, if there's anything you wanted to highlight from 22 to kind of illustrate any points you're making, but the reality is once you're in the playoffs, it's a 3-week sprint for finding the best roster construction and players to give you a chance to win via that.
Yes, and some of it is going to be you have to go into your priors, go into your favorite content creators of, hey, who should I be picking up for the playoffs? And just trust it. And there's going to be stuff that happens that you can't control. Mm-hmm. And just like when you have that random week in week 5 where you're going up against the worst team in the league, and then all of a sudden you end up putting up a dud and they end up smashing it out of the park and they beat you by 4 points. That sort of stuff can happen in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And the thing that we're trying to do is remove as much of that variance as possible through your roster construction and through building your team in a smart way. Yep.
Now, in best ball, it's not going to hit as hard as it would in lineup, the points I'm going to make here about the receivers. Because in best ball, frankly, I'd love to have a deep team of receivers and kind of, if I have, 10, 12, the bottom 5 can all basically go and filter warm bodies in, right? And any one of those guys 1 week can absolutely matter. So I'm not telling you not to add wide receivers in best ball leagues. That's absolutely the opposite of what I would tell you. But the point I'm making here kind of carries to both lineup and best ball. And you'll see here, so if we go through, right, you had Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, everyone kind of knows what the guys were at the top, right? This is what they were throughout weeks 1 through 17, right? But when you go run the numbers here in 14, I'm going to run them 14 through 17 here real quick, Koopa, because from what I remember, and we'll check my memory here, you're going to see that you don't have in this 3-week window. Now, during a 1-week window, you may have a guy be a spike week or a consistent week. But if you talk about a 3-week span, these are all going to be pretty big names. Justin Jefferson, DeVonta Smith, A.J. Brown, C.D. Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Zay Jones got in there, right? So I'm not saying you can't get them, but a lot of these guys, Jerry Jeudy was already having a good year, KJ Osborne's in there, Mike Evans, but a lot of these guys, I think, I'm not telling you not to add them, but you'll see that there's a lot more consistency typically with guys that are actually to be had and guys that are significantly valuable at receiver in the 3-week window. And opportunity change doesn't necessarily give you, like at running back position, right? If I know a guy has an opportunity that they didn't have before, that's what I absolutely want that guy in a best ball or in a lineup league. Just because a receiver is going to have a shit ton of opportunity randomly because of injuries or whatever doesn't mean it's going to amount to any type of dynasty or fantasy value. So that's the last point I wanted to make about receivers and quarterbacks, where those are typically a lot more stable, where you can still add guys. You can find a waiver wire gem at quarterback or at receiver, but you can pencil in opportunity for a running back a lot easier if that comes in the playoffs when people are getting hurt.
For sure, and the thing to remember is that we talk about wide receivers and that targets are earned. If just because the wide receiver ahead of them goes down doesn't
Correct.
mean they get that wide receiver's targets and production.
Correct.
Running back, that happens a little bit more often. And so that's the sort of thing that's the reason that we talk about, hey, running back is where you want to try and get it the last possible minute. Yep. Receiver, because it is something that's a little more consistent, same with quarterback, it's a little bit more consistent. That's why you can go and target those positions now. And then if you don't have a trade deadline or your trade deadline is later, you target your running backs at the last possible moment.
Yep. I love it, man. I love it. I think that's all I got, buddy. I think that's all I got. Is there anything you got? I'm going to give you, listen, you built the tool. You've been helping people along the way with the data. Midway through, man. This is where we're at. This is kind of what we went through. So any final points or last thoughts before we roll?
Definitely, if you have not sat down with the tool and taken a league that you feel like you understand, and then change that week slider to be different ranges across different groups, where you've gone weeks 1 through 3, where you've taken weeks 5 through 8, where because 5 through 8 is in the middle of bye weeks, but it's still the same number of weeks as weeks 1 through 4. So 1 through 4, 5 through 8, they're both 4-week windows.
Right.
Just compare the two. Take a look at what happens during bye weeks. How many more players appear as positive WoRP guys, and that'll help give you an idea of, is my team potentially built for the season long marathon, and I need to make some changes in order to win the ending sprint. Because unlike a true marathon where you can do a little bit every single week and just keep going and going and going until you're at the end and you're so far ahead of everybody that no matter how fast they sprint, they can't catch up to you. In our world, just because you have won the marathon, everybody's starting at the same exact point on that final sprint. And you have to have enough in the tank to be able to go and win that final sprint too.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. I think the other thing too, like, I'll say this: if you have, we talk about, especially like in lineup leagues, you talk about, or if Scott talked about it with Scott, we talk about it too. You don't want to have too much depth. You want to have a lot of depth, right? But you don't have too much, because you want to be able to put it into places and ultimately run as thin as you can while having the horses at the top. One thing, whether you're in either format, is if you understand if you have a deadline or not and when that is, because at positions that matter, and you can use the tool for this. I don't want to go pull a bunch of stuff back on the tool and stuff like this and keep people here for too long. But one point I'll make is, if okay, in your league, this league right here I know is a running back heavy league. So that I feel pretty confident almost every week I can find a body on the wire or whatever. There is a deadline though. So like, I can't add via trade people to I can't trade in the playoffs, right? So whatever happens, I have to find from the wire or I'm screwed. In best ball league, like, that team's so spread out, it doesn't matter. But when you have a lineup league, let's say, and you are shallow, and let's say quarterback scoring is imperative, and wide receiver scoring is ridiculous. Like, you may, if you have a deadline, say, you know what, I might need to buy a quarterback 3 that's better than what I have, or something as an insurance policy, because you can't go, if you don't have a deadline, you can say, all right, can I pivot off of my hurt Jalen Hurts? Can I pivot off of my hurt Lamar Jackson and get another stud? You might be able to do that if you don't. But if you don't have a deadline, you're not going to find that on the wire. So it's another thing to keep in mind for the playoffs too, understanding your deadline and how to prep for, backfilling. And is it a position that you can realistically find on the wire or not?
Absolutely.
Love it, man. All right. Well, I appreciate you hopping on, dude. This is fun. I always enjoy pulling up the WoRP tool, showing everybody about it. We appreciate you hopping here. We appreciate everybody that tapped in today. We will see you back here next week. We won't hijack it. We'll give you the Week 11 preview, back to the weekly previews until the playoffs come around. And Koopa, we'll have to have you back on either, here or one of the other shows so that we can do this again. I think right around the playoffs start, maybe we can do one more last comb over, a little fresher one for everybody. But right now I wanted to get ahead of it, prep you. While people are probably still thinking about, attrition and their teams and winning one week, maybe you can get ahead of the game and start thinking about winning your title. So don't jump the gun. Make sure you still get to the playoffs, but let's think about winning it too. All right, we'll see you back here, same time, same place next week. We're out of this thing. Peace.